Today, we're going to cover some things about Trent and the Council of Trent. I want to preface this by making a few important remarks. One, while I am going to be critiquing a few points in the aftermath of Trent, I'm by no means here to critique Trent itself, especially not the doctrinal formulations of its canons. In fact, I find the canons of Trent surprisingly moderate, despite what I was always told, and despite what maybe many Protestants contend. I know Chemnitz, among others, treated Trent like it's the pariah of all Christendom, but if you really just kind of take your time with Trent, you'll see it's actually not as extreme as it's often critiqued as being. And I'm really in no place to even battle with the disciplinary elements of the council as they exist in the canons, right? That's a very special field. And this subject, like much of modernity in general, is just unbelievably complex and multifaceted, which leads me to my second point. I don't really know who all watches this channel. I know some of the people that participate in the comment sections and whatnot, but I want to assume for a moment that I don't have a large contingency of scholars and members of academia scouring through my live streams. Most of those types know, and in my honest opinion, kind of take for granted just how unbelievably complex history is, especially when you're looking at it from a wide, generalized level. And there's really two worlds in the field of history. Those things which are produced to be consumed at a popular level, and then those which are produced to be consumed by other scholars. Now, scholarly work tends to focus on small areas, and it tries to pull in all the many and diverse elements of that area, which is ideal, but it also leaves only a very niche audience for consumption of the material. Popular history, on the other hand, is by necessity kind of leaves out all of the many diverse elements, and consequently it becomes the popular history that we know and we keep repeating. But history is not a neatly wrapped present with a tidy bow. It's like it's like a modernist canvas with all its elemental colors like splattered across the page, that's sort of mixed up and distorted, and good luck trying to parcel it out. But the unfortunate reality to all of this is that we're unable as a species, if you will, to pass on the full story at popular levels. So what I'm going to try to do here, and what I try to do in general, is to bridge the two worlds, right? I attempt to possibly fail at this, but the goal is to pull in some of the many and diverse parts in a way that doesn't lose my audience. So we'll see how I succeed with this. So for those of you that may not be aware, Trent is the Ecumenical Council of the Church. It's the 19th Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church. It was called to address the errors of the Protestant Reformation and also to reform the Catholic Church itself. Now, it's the latter parts of that I want to focus on today. So in order to do that, as always with history, you need to go back. And we have to go back into the medieval world, right? By the time you get to Trent, By the time you get to the Reformation and Trent and the aftermath of all of that, you're beginning to work your way into modernity, my opinion. Before that, we're still dealing very much with the medieval world. Even the Renaissance, the Renaissance is still the medieval world. And in the medieval world, there were certain practices, there were certain customs and devotions that were practiced, yet sometimes, especially coming up into the heels of the Protestant Reformation, they were being derided and denounced from clergy and from would-be reformers. For one, the penitent at this time would often go to a friary, to the Franciscans, for example, for confession. They would not go to the parish priest, who was seen at the time as not well equipped to handle the nuances of the confessional. As well, in the medieval period, the friars, the mendicants in particular, were your primary preachers, not the parish priest. And you would have these swarms of crowds gather to hear long sermons from men like St. Bernardino and others. The homily at Mass would either be, non-existent or not very good. Whereas this traveling friar, if they were a good speaker, they could hold large crowds for long periods of time. So, we tend to think of the sermon as a very Protestant thing, but it actually has its roots in the medieval Catholic Church. But the roles of the religious orders in the spiritual life would drastically change in the coming decades. Another thing was that certain pious devotions as practiced by the laity, many, including Dominicans like Manfredi and Cajetan, would seek to suppress what they saw as these novel devotions, what kind of new in their day. These devotions, for example, of the sufferings of the Virgin Mary, or the veneration of the Most Holy Name of Jesus. So their works against these devotions began the long march of suppressing Western medieval piety that took sharp root in the Protestant Revolution, but also had its place in the Catholic Church as well. You find many of these people in the years after Luther's break trying to reconcile the great church father Augustine and his views on sin and grace. And you can't underestimate the degree that these debates would have on later developments within the Catholic Church. Leaving aside the Protestant revolt, right? Just coming to terms with Augustine among ourselves within the Catholic community. So all of this in the medieval world is there, and it's starting to be questioned, and the calls for reform are oftentimes calls to do away with these pious practices and to re-engage Augustine in some of his more, shall we say, darker elements. But I want to go back specifically to an interim period between the outbreak of Luther's reforms and the Catholic Church's reforms that were to come. And a good starting point for this is with the election of Paul III, Pope Paul III. Now, Paul III was not a full speed ahead reforming pope, but he was prudent enough to realize that he needed counsel to figure out what the situation was that had been erupting in recent years. This is after Luther's Reformation. So this is after Luther's Reformation, before the Council of Trent. So he pulls together a group that is very important. The group is collectively referred to today as the Spirituality. This begins with a Spanish humanist named Alfonso Valdez and his various students, many of whom were actually sympathetic to Luther on justification specifically. And these include preachers like Bernardino Acino and Peter Martyr Vermigli, two important names that we'll come back to later. And he himself also had sympathies and close teachings with another spirituality named Cardarini of Venice, and as well Reginald Pole of England. So these are reforming men. At this point, They're looking for ecclesial reforms, yes, but they're also looking for doctrinal reforms as well. But anyways, in 1535, Paul III gives the cardinal hats to Contarini, to Poole, to Sadoleto, and a certain pariah among this group, Carafa. And this is another important name that we're going to come back to as well. Now, together, they are commissioned to write a memorial to the Pope. They entitle it the Concilium de Emendanda Ecclesia, which was revolutionary in the truest sense of that word in its language. I mean, its bluntness would shock even modern Catholic readers. It places the blame for everything from Luther's Reformation to the corruption and the ills of the church squarely at the feet of the papacy, the cardinals, and the curia. And this document actually was leaked, and it sent shockwaves throughout Europe. And the Protestants themselves, they kind of snickered when they read it, and they loved to like point to it to help them like sort of confirm their cause. Now at this point, you begin to see Carafa begin to pull away from the spirituality, beginning a path that would eventually lead him to open hostile conflict with these other Catholic reformers. In 1541, the talks at the Regensburg Diet between Lutherans and the spirituality, most notably Cardinal Contarini, fell apart. And this gave Carafa the upper hand and the ammunition that he needed. So what he did is he forms and imposes a Roman Inquisition that set out to condemn all of his former allies, including Contarini. Now, in reaction to this, you have many of these spirituality people flee Italy, including infamously Ochino, who at this point was one of the founding members of the Capuchin Franciscan order, that the Capuchin reform movement, and he almost upended and completely undid the work of the Capuchins, because when he left, he as well as Peter Martyr Vermigli, they both fled Italy for Calvin's Geneva and then publicly became Protestants, further fueling Carafa's paranoia about the spirituality. Because it began this like, okay, these spirituality who are calling for these reforms are actually crypto Protestants, right? That we have to be on the lookout for. And Ochino and Peter Martyr just made that example of that. So regardless, in the midst of all of this, Paul III manages to convene against all odds the first sessions of the Council of Trent. Many of the key spirituality figures are present at Trent, including Cardinal Pole, Mandruzzo, the French Cardinal Roussel. They were all present, and Pole himself opened the council with a very solemn and penitential sermon. And astoundingly, the council began deliberating right off the bat on justification. There was a little bit of controversy about whether the previous council, Lateran V, was just kind of it's only 30, 40 years before that Lateran V took place, and Lateran V was supposed to be a reforming council. Nothing actually came of it. So there was this feeling that Trent was going to be the same, but right off the bat they jump into Luther and justification. As well, they go into the authority in the church, whether it would be sacred scripture alone or sacred scripture and tradition. And if you were at all suspicious that the heavy topics would be avoided, you kind of have to think again. Also, astoundingly, the influential men like Pole did not win the day at the council, at least not in their belief that Luther got justification right. It was not upheld. The church upheld the traditional Catholic teaching of faith working through love. That's another topic. But still, while still a very respected man among the reformers, Cardinal Reginald Pole himself almost became pope until it was sabotaged by Carafa at the last minute in the conclave. But he never again regained prominence in Rome or at the council that he initially had. He would actually go on later to serve in the ill-fated courts of Mary Tudor in England. But so while pushing, at least doctrinally, at Trent, everything seems to be going towards that more away from where the spirituality we're looking at doctrinally. In 1555, Carafa himself becomes Pope. He becomes Pope Paul IV, and he dismisses the council. And he sets about to put in place his own reforms. His attitude was, I don't need a council to reform. I can do this all on my own. And he sets Rome on not a literal fire, a figurative fire with his draconian reforms. I mean, he declares the spirituality men like Pole, who was by then this point in England. He declares Pole a heretic. He declares the newly formed Jesuit leader Ignatius Loyola a heretic. The beloved and morally impeccable Cardinal Primate of Spain, Archbishop Carranza, is declared a heretic by Paul. Basically, everybody is a heretic to Paul IV. He introduces the ill-fated, though at times effective as a propaganda weapon against a rival, the ill-fated Roman Index of Prohibited Books that more authoritarian members at the time and today claim to love. Yet it notoriously, and this is sometimes forgotten by traditionalists, it placed Ignatius on the list of prohibited books. Teresa of Avila was on there. Robert Bellarmine himself got put on the index of prohibited books for a while. So, it wasn't a very effective nor very consistent thing. But anyways, Paul IV had the Jews placed in ghettos. He had prostitutes rounded up and arrested. He had beggars forcibly removed from the city. He had this immense, spectacular hatred for all things Spanish, and he almost plunged Italy into a war against the country that was historically the greatest ally to the papacy, to the shock of all of Europe, including Protestants who couldn't believe that this guy was so out of control that he would be this way towards the Catholic Church's most consistent adherents. So Paul IV was the great tragic papacy of the era because he was a reforming man, okay, of a singular kind of integrity that was really just brought down by his own paranoia and lack of vision. And when he died, I mean, all of Rome celebrated when Paul IV died. The people went through the town and they opened up the prisons where the people from the Roman Inquisition had placed in prison, releasing all the Catholic reforming prisoners. But I don't think that we can ignore these two strains of thought running through Trent. On the one hand, you have the spirituality with its own fringe elements that were more Protestant leaning, enough to the point that men like Ochino and Peter Martyr leave Italy altogether to go join the reform, to the more authoritarian, repressive elements like the powerful followers of Carafa. A good comparison would be to compare the papacies between Paul III and the Fourth. It's important here because in Paul III, you see a man who could hold together the intricacies of men from on one side the spirituality and on the other side men like Carafa. He's also someone who saw the benefits of Ignatius's Jesuits. He saw the reforms that needed to take place in the Catholic Church as the Church itself going on the offensive, making the Catholic Church ready to take on the world, compared to the papacy of Paul IV, where the Catholic Church was to be reactionary and defensive and walled off from the world. It's two very different views of the Church that we still kind of contend with to this day. These two dialectics, these two poles would be the future of the Catholic Church in its reforming era and beyond. And so this is where, while I say there are no real, quote, reforming popes after Trent in a singular sense, because some of them lean one way, like Pius IV, he leans more towards maybe, say, Paul III, whereas Pius V leans more towards, say, a Carafa. elements, but both went on to continue and continuing the council and enacting the Tridentine reforms. For example, Pius V, just to show you how some of these elements came to play, Pius V, using the calls from Trent to reform the liturgy, set about to standardize all of the Western missals under the Roman Rite. The problem here stemmed from the issues with subversive priests, many of whom were crypto-Protestants. They were rejecting the sacrifice of the Mass, right? There was an infamous example of a priest. I don't remember what area he was from, but he would, because you're reciting it in Latin, and this priest would recite the words at the words of consecration. He would say in Latin, "Bread it is, and bread it shall remain." Okay. These kind of crypto-Protestant priests took advantage of the lack of uniformity to insert, in the best of situations, dubious things into the liturgy. In the worst of situations, they would insert just outright heretical things. So in response to this, the Council of Trent, Pope Pius V, declared that all liturgies that were less than 4 centuries old would have to come under the rubrics of the Tridentine form. Now, while I get why he felt this needed to be done. The fringe elements needed to be reined in. But there were legitimate rites that went under because of Pius's kind of drastic solution. So we lost some of that beautiful diversity of the European medieval liturgical life for a rite that, while certainly retains ancient elements and many beautiful elements, was not by divine decree the sole liturgical expression of the Catholic Church, as some today would like to claim that the Tridentine Rite was. And one thing was for certain, though, about the Mass of Pius V, and this is on doubt, that no Protestant worth his own would dare say the Tridentine form of the Mass, because they were clear, the Catholic reformers made certain that the sacrificial language was front and center, from the very beginning, with the words of the priest as he approaches the altar of sacrifice. That was very intentional with what they were trying to eradicate by doing this. So this gets kind of at what I was really trying to discuss with this talk. While the doctrinal reforms were, as a Catholic, we have to say that they were all doctrinally sound, true, and right. Some of the ways which the Church handled the ecclesial reforms, the disciplinary reforms, we can at least look at objectively, much in the way that people do with Vatican II today, the Second Vatican Council, and assess the good and the bad without rejecting the Council. This is important because, as many of you are aware, there are those today who want to outright reject the Second Vatican Council because of its implementation. Yet these same people probably could not tell you all of the nuances in the implementation of Trent, because you can't with any integrity hold that all the sides at play after Trent, some of them in opposition to each other, you can't hold them all, right? So you can't be like, well, no, I'm for Trent, right? Well, it's like, okay, but what do you even mean by that, right? Like, which group would you have landed on? Because to land on one group would put you in opposition to another group. Hopefully I'm making sense with that. And this actually does have some doctrinal ramifications later on, when groups like the Janicists, who were more from that Caraffin line of thinking, claimed that Augustine, that say like Calvin got Augustine right with the double predestination, and that this was actually correct Catholic teaching. So again, you can see there are many sides to this. But going back to where we were with the history, not long after Pius V, you get Pope Sixtus V. And, here was a pope that ruled with an iron fist. He went for a major moral purge of Rome. He had the religious who broke their vows of celibacy executed. He attempted it for spouses that had committed adultery, but didn't actually get that through. He went hard after banditry, which banditry was something that had plagued Italy for centuries. But he was also went on to this kind of patronizing plan for the arts that really would rival any of the Renaissance popes. So at this time, there's this new vibrancy movement to rebuild Rome, which led to some of the unique things that coincided with this movement of rebuilding Rome. There's many like interesting things that coincided with it. For example, one of the most spectacular being this movement of Saint Philip Neri, who led a group called the Oratorians into the catacombs of Rome, where they started this revised interest into the catacombs. At that point had been basically all but forgotten, and Philip Neri brought these people down into the catacombs, and they revised this interest in this forgotten underground world, where by the 1570s they were rediscovering all of these ancient frescoes and the bones that were sort of harkening the Catholic Reform movement back to its ancient roots. And all of this archaeological work was being done and backed by the papacy. And this gets to another issue, right? The question of the role of the papacy versus the role of the bishops in implementing reform. This was hotly contested at the Council of Trent. What roles the bishops played. And what we find is that the council, unlike what many traditionalists would want you to believe, Trent was not uniformly implemented. It really came down to several factors, including how the secular powers were willing or unwilling, as well as how the bishops were willing or unwilling and what the secular rulers were doing. So in Venice, for example, the locals had long resented Roman and Spanish powers, and they fought against any encroachment into their like cosmopolitan city, including the reforms of Trent, which they saw as basically just being led by the Pope. In France, the king declared that Trent would not be implemented in his country, even though still many French prelates became some of the most fastidious Tridentine reformers on the continent. So it's a very complex issue. But into that vacuum, by the confusion of who should lead, the papacy stepped into it. Undoubtedly, the reforms of Trent were led by the papacy, from the changing of the liturgy to the changing of the breviary, to publishing a catechism, revising the index of prohibited books, to writing up regulations for how to implement this new thing that was going to be called seminaries. Some of you don't know that the seminaries actually began from Trent. Should we talk about the seminaries? That's kind of its own topic, but of course, now the Pope was working with bishops that were willing to work with him, that were the ones that were most active. And there was none more representative of the bishop that's willing to work with the Pope than the indefatigable Carlos Borromeo, right? St. Carlos. Probably the single most significant singular personality of the post-Tridentine era. Borromeo was actually placed in the position that he was in by a form of nepotism that Trent came to fight against hard. But even still, you're hard-pressed to find someone more enthusiastic to interpret and enact Trent than Carlos. So he becomes Bishop of Milan, a city that had notoriously not had a bishop for about 80 years. He enters the city in 1565, dressed in his archbishop robes, not the dress of the cardinal, which he was. And he has this great sense of the importance of the city as the city of Ambrose, right? One thing about St. Borromeo, though, is that he was an obsessive administrator that implemented the type of bureaucracy that was very effective in the wake of Trent, but that would come to kind of plague the church later on. He founded one of the very first seminaries and set the precedent for how the seminary system was to be run as it was envisioned by Trent. He placed great emphasis on priests being trained in preaching, and that the homily was to become the primary source for preaching to the laity. And of course, my dog's going to freak out. Stop. He reverses the medieval practice of friars being the primary preachers instructing the faithful as well. So gone is that like medieval like tradition where your principal preachers are these traveling friars, which is, as a medievalist myself, I kind of think that would be kind of cool to have, just like traveling friars walking all around the United States coming to preach to us all. But anyways, it kind of gets away from that. Then it becomes the homily and the parish priest. He also made the confessional the dominion of the parish priest, right? Taking yet another job away from the medieval friars. And these moves were eventually copied by other bishops, setting this setting this tide where the parish priest's role, hey bud, setting the role of the parish priest kind of becomes as we know it today. It's very Tridentine. The relationship between the parish priest and the parishioner today is very Tridentine, over and against, say, what the role that the religious orders had in the past. Now, Borromeo, in my opinion, exemplifies this odd thread of the Tridentine reforms where you have these like undeniably holy and determined men. I mean, it's undeniable that Borromeo himself was a holy man. And they were also, though, like these holy men were like prone to a type of reform that would be seen by medieval people anyways as being puritanical, were puritanical a word at the time. I mean, for example, Borromeo trained priests to find out from women in the confessional whether they were sleeping with infants in a way that was believed to be causing infant mortality. It was like a co-sleeping thing that was thought to be the cause of infant mortality. So he was training priests to get this information from women. In turn, women stopped coming to the confessional, enough so that he actually had to put a stop to this. Um, he also, as well, tries to suppress the Milanese carnivals, which of course go back to the Middle Ages, right? In the Middle Ages, they love their carnivals and their festivals, but that festive ethos, while certainly in need of being checked, was not about to be abolished. So this tendency at times, in my opinion, led to abuses by men later who were not as holy nor well intentioned as, say, men like Borromeo were. It's a mentality that I believe infects traditionalism to this day. For example, right, going back to the index of prohibited books in Italy at this time, on the index of prohibited books was the Bible in the vernacular. You have to keep in mind that the people that were tasked with running the office of the index of prohibited books and coming up with what to add to it, these were not scholars. They were not scholars of theology, and they were often overwhelmed with the sheer volume of stuff that's coming in the wake of the printing press. This revolutionary thing where the printing press is making all of this work of written word available and accessible to people, and it took Robert Bellarmine, who would later ironically find himself on the book of prohibited books, on the index of prohibited books. It took him to come in and kind of put a stop to the ridiculous attempts of these guys who were trying to basically banish all writing from Europe, which is something that some of them were pushing for. Now, one of the things I think we know today in hindsight that they didn't necessarily consider with all of these new technologies was the effect that banning something had on the prestige of the work. Works that may otherwise have just sort of languished in obscurity suddenly became like titillating libel that more rebellious elements of society would seek out, because it was, this is true right up to the modern age as well, right? Where in the 20th century, you have in the United States these Catholic leagues that were forming to prohibit the consumption of certain movies. Well, marketers of these products are not stupid people, and they learned in time that for their movie to get that stamp of forbidden actually helped to increase sales. So it in turn incentivized them to produce more and more salacious material to be put on these banned lists. So that's one of the things coming out of Trent that was a little bit, while the intentions were well meaning and there and enacted by holy men, it got a little out of hand. There's also a general suspicion in the wake of Trent of mysticism. hugely influential in the medieval church is this mystical identity of certain people. In the wake of Trent, while not necessarily the fault of the Tridentine reforms, it certainly stems from this post-humanist skepticism and the clergy's general dislike of popular devotions. I'm gonna do the next thing I'm gonna release maybe later this week or next week is going to be about the controversy surrounding a particular Franciscan devotion in the medieval times, late medieval period, due to some humanists. But even after Trent, right, almost victim to this suspicion of mysticism is none other than Teresa of Avila herself, who was a phenomenal woman who sought to return her Carmelite order back to the austerity of its roots. And her work with the fellow radical mystic poet Juan de la Cruz found both of them in trouble with the unreformed Carmelites. Juan himself was imprisoned and beaten by very powerful opponents, like physically beaten. And this type of suspicion has plagued the church since the Reformation, where popular devotions and piety, especially new ones that show up, are really scorned and mocked. I mean, that's from the bishop's response to Bernadette at Lourdes to recent traditionalists that want to condemn Faustina's Divine Mercy. The role of humanist skepticism on popular piety and mysticism and the reactionary tendencies of the Carafin party, if you will, has a profound impact on the church's identity. You know, from the excesses of certain puritanical tendencies to the centralization in later centuries that would be used against more draconian reformers. And this is actually something to consider. I hope I'm making sense with all of this, but maybe, maybe something to talk about at another date, where at one time the traditionalists benefited from this centralization. Now they seem to find themselves on the receiving end of some of it, right? The sort of the irony of this, where before it was sort of the progressives, if you will, that sort of found themselves at the ire of the Carafin centralization party. It's the tables have been turned a little bit in modern times. And this kind of includes what happened to our seminaries as well, right? Like the seminaries were formed in the wake of Trent to hone it, to rein in the sort of insanity of how priests were being formed and to put out more orthodox priests. Well, that same centralization and institutionalization was maybe later weaponized against some of the more orthodox things that Trent was actually looking to do. Okay. And yet, despite this, despite the events that accumulated leading up to Trent, that easily could have derailed it into any given direction, whether the more Protestant, it could have ended up totally like a Protestant council, or just this draconian type thing. Despite all of that, Trent actually stands up quite well, much like Vatican II, so often lambasted by traditionalists. Trent, when you look at it objectively, holds up remarkably well. And as the Catholic Church left Europe and became a worldwide religion, it's in many ways because of the Tridentine reforms that this endeavor was so radically effective. The reason that we're a worldwide religion today is really because of the reforms of Trent. Now, had it been simply had Carafa had his way, right? Had it been a Carafin endeavor, Pope Paul IV, sort of bent on paranoia and oppression and not a sincere desire to spread the gospel to all the ends of the earth, the reforms really never would have taken root. So, if you listen to that speech from that show, gosh, I guess it's been maybe 10 years ago, the young Pope, that sort of infamous speech that Pope gives that the trads just seem to love, where he sort of personifies that Carafin model. I don't know if that was intentional or not. In many ways, this goes against the successes of Trent. While I don't hold to the excesses of the spirituality by any extent, the question does remain: are we to be closed off from the world, so to remain this like pure, clean church, Or are we to be a church that goes into the world and it gets dirty in the process, right? So I'll leave you guys with this. There's a story from Vladimir Solovyov's work, Russia and the Universal Church. It's one of the very first stories, I think, in the entire book. And it's about two saints, one of them being Saint Nicholas, two bishop saints who are on their way to heaven. And they're in their bishop's robes. This is a pious legend that Solovyov tells at the beginning of the story. Solovyov himself was an Orthodox who admired the Latin Catholic Church, and he tells this legend. All right, so the Saint Nicholas and this other saint bishop are on their way to heaven when they see that there is a family with a horse and cart that's stuck, that has a broken wheel. So Saint Nicholas says, "I'm going to go tend to this family." The other saint says, "I don't want to get my robe dirty." St. Nicholas goes down and he tends to this family, fixes the wheel, and gets his bishop robes covered in dirt. In the process, he has to enter heaven because he went out into the world. He has to enter heaven dirty. Solovyov says he's actually making a comparison between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. I think it actually applies somewhat maybe to the traditionalists as well, even though that wouldn't have been a thing in Solovyov's time. Solovyov says that while the Orthodox have remained pristine and their robes are not dirty, well, they also haven't gone out into the world and in the way that the Catholic Church has, especially after the reforms of Trent. And so when you look at the Catholic Church, and he says at times it does look dirty, and at times it's like you're kind of like, what is going on? At the same time, the Catholic Church is in the trenches of this war, this battle that we are all facing against the powers of this world, princely powers of this world. The reason that the Catholic Church at times has mud on its face is because it's actually in there trying to change those wheels and help humanity out. So that's what I want to leave you guys with. That's what I got today. Maybe it was a little bit different than what you guys were expecting with this talk. Hopefully you learned something. I don't know, ideally I would do these kind of talks and I would have like slides and stuff with them, but it takes a while to sort of pull my notes together and do these things. And when I add slides, it's like a whole nother endeavor. So hopefully you guys enjoyed these kind of like off the cuff. So I don't see any questions or anything like that. So I'm at 45 minutes. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll be coming out with some new stuff. I got a series of lives. I think I published at least publish the dates. So keep an eye out for those if you're interested. Hopefully you enjoyed this one, and God bless you all. I'll see you soon.